Daniel, the pond, wide and still beneath the afternoon sun, shimmered like a mirror of liquid glass. Beneath its surface, hundreds of koi glided in slow circles, each one hand-raised since infancy, each one worth far more to Daniel than the tens of thousands of dollars collectors had once offered him. They were his legacy, his meditation, and his only true family since his father's passing 5 years earlier. The pond was the heart of his property, an oasis carefully engineered with a private filtration and drainage system that he himself had designed and registered as independent from the neighborhood utilities. He lived on the edge of a suburban development ruled by an aggressive homeowners association, but his home technically stood just outside their jurisdiction line, a small strip of land that gave him the freedom to live by his own rules. He liked to think of it as poetic justice, a man who made a career in environmental systems keeping a piece of nature alive amid manicured conformity. From his porch, Daniel could see the artificial perfection of the HOA houses lined along the cul-de-sac. Cloned lawns, pastel facades, uniform hedges trimmed to exact heights. Every week, the same women with clipboards patrolled, measuring fence colors and counting inches of grass. Their leader, Jennifer Hope, carried herself like an elected monarch, her smile never reaching her eyes, her tone wrapped in silk but lined with steel. She had once visited Daniel under the pretense of community relations, hinting that his pond was a potential hazard because it wasn't included in the HOA maintenance database. Daniel had listened politely, explaining that the pond was fully private, fully compliant with county law, and had existed long before the HOA expanded. Jennifer's smile had stiffened, and she left him with a phrase that stuck in his memory. "We all have to live by the same standards, Mr. Murakami. Even you." For months after that, letters arrived, thin envelopes printed with the HOA seal, couched in legal phrasing that wavered between warning and intimidation. They demanded access to inspect possible drainage concerns, cited fabricated complaints from neighbors about mosquito infestations, and threatened fines for non-cooperation with community safety assessments. Daniel ignored them all, sending back copies of his property deed and the state certification proving his water system was self-contained. He thought reason and documentation would shield him from their bureaucracy, but the tone of the letters changed, growing sharper, more personal. When he confronted Jennifer during an open HOA meeting, the exchange turned public and humiliating. She accused him of disregarding community harmony and acting above regulation, while he countered that she was abusing her authority for personal satisfaction. The room went silent, the tension heavy as the still air before a storm. She smiled again, that same brittle porcelain smile, and said only, "Then I suppose we'll see whose rules apply here." That night, Daniel walked around the pond, tracing the rim with a flashlight. The koi rose to the surface, their mouths breaking the water in silent greeting, expecting the handfuls of pellets he always brought. He felt the old peace return, a fragile sense that the world could be balanced if only he cared enough to maintain it. The water reflected the moon, pale and undisturbed, and he told himself that the HOA couldn't touch something so pure, so utterly his. But beneath that calm, a ripple of unease crept through him. He had seen how far Jennifer went to assert control over trivialities like fence paint and mailbox shapes. What would she do when defiance came from someone she couldn't fine or threaten into submission? Daniel turned off the flashlight and listened to the soft murmur of the filtration pump, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He didn't know then that in less than a week that sound would vanish, replaced by the hollow hiss of draining water and the silence of death spreading through the pond he had built to last a lifetime. It was a Saturday morning when Daniel first sensed that something was wrong. The air was unusually still, heavy with the kind of silence that made the trees seem watchful. From his kitchen window, he could see the faint shimmer of sunlight over the pond, but something about the color seemed off. The water, usually clear enough to reflect the sky like a polished mirror, looked dull and muted, as though a shadow had fallen across its surface. He stepped outside, barefoot on the dewy grass, and before he reached the edge, the sound reached him. A soft, irregular slapping, the frantic struggle of something alive in distress. For a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. His koi, the creatures he had raised for decades, were thrashing near the muddy shallows, their bright scales flashing in the dim light like dying embers. The waterline had dropped by nearly 2 feet. The pumps were still humming, but the filtration system wheezed with dry suction, pulling air where water should have been. Daniel's stomach twisted as he sprinted toward the control panel, his hands trembling as he checked the valves. Everything appeared normal until he noticed the drainage cap. A heavy, locked mechanism at the far end of the pond had been pried open. The padlock was missing, the bolts freshly scratched. Someone had forced it. He followed the pipe outlet that led underground toward the main drainage channel bordering the HOA's managed retention basin. The ground near the grate was soaked and uneven, covered in the kind of sludge that only comes from sudden water release. The metal plate that covered the drainage valve had been lifted, and in its place sat a shiny new fitting, industrial grade, recently installed. Daniel crouched down, brushing the mud away with his fingers, and saw a faint stamp on the metal. Property of Hope, Creek, HOA Maintenance Division. He froze, staring at the words, the realization sinking in like ice. His mind went blank for a moment before fury began to rise, slow and steady, like a tide reclaiming its shore. He ran back to the house, grabbing his phone to call the police, and as he waited for the dispatcher to connect him, a white pickup truck rolled up to the edge of his driveway. The door bore the HOA logo. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand, the casual arrogance of someone who believed he had nothing to fear. "Morning," the man said, as if this were any other routine check. "We were just finishing up the drainage maintenance. Hope everything's holding up on your end." Daniel's voice cracked with restrained rage as he demanded to know what they had done. The worker blinked, feigning confusion. "Just standard inspection," he replied smoothly. "We had reports of water buildup affecting the retention system. Miss Hope approved a pressure release this morning." Daniel could barely speak. "You drained my pond. Do you have any idea what that water contained?" "Those are living creatures, endangered koi, some of them irreplaceable." The man shifted his weight, his eyes avoiding Daniel's. "Sir, I just follow orders. If you have complaints, you can take them up with the board." Then, without another word, he climbed back into the truck and drove off, leaving tire tracks gouged into the wet earth. Daniel stood motionless, watching the truck disappear down the road. He could still hear the faint gurgle of the pond, the desperate gasping of fish trapped in shrinking puddles. He ran to the shed, grabbed the hose, and began refilling the basin. But it was useless. The drainage pipe had been opened too wide, and the water poured out faster than he could replace it. He waded knee-deep into the mud, scooping up koi with his bare hands, transferring them into buckets, anything that might hold water. Some were already lifeless, their brilliant colors dulled to a ghostly gray. Others floated weakly, their gills fluttering. He didn't cry. He couldn't. There was a hollow space inside him where the shock settled, cold and heavy. By the time animal control and the local police arrived, it was too late. More than half the fish were dead. The officer who took his statement glanced over the scene, clearly uncomfortable, and admitted that the HOA's jurisdiction complicated matters. "Technically," the officer said, "if they believed there was a safety issue, they might have legal authority to access the drainage system. You'll need to contact your lawyer." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. A safety issue? They killed over 100 koi. That's destruction of private property. The officer hesitated. "Look, I'll file the report, but you should also document everything. Photos, serial numbers on the valves, anything that proves tampering." The word tampering echoed in Daniel's mind. It wasn't just vandalism, it was calculated punishment. That afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the trees, Jennifer Hope herself arrived, dressed in her usual pale blazer, her heels sinking slightly into the damp ground. She didn't look at the dead fish floating near the bank. Her gaze stayed fixed on Daniel, cool and composed. "I heard there was some trouble," she said softly, as if she were addressing a child who had broken a rule. Daniel's voice was sharp. "You ordered this. Don't pretend you didn't." She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "No one ordered anything malicious, Mr. Murakami. The maintenance team was conducting an emergency drainage test after multiple complaints about overflow. We have to protect the neighborhood from potential flooding." Daniel stepped closer, the mud sucking at his boots. "That pond isn't yours to touch. You knew it was self-contained. You knew exactly what would happen." Jennifer's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "If that's true, I'm sure you'll prove it. But perhaps next time, you'll consider cooperating with community guidelines instead of resisting them." When she left, the sky turned dark, and Daniel remained by the pond, surrounded by silence broken only by the occasional splash of dying fish. He looked around and saw how small his property seemed under the weight of the HOA's control, how fragile his independence had become. The water was nearly gone now, leaving behind a graveyard of colorless scales glinting beneath the last trace of daylight. He knelt beside the edge, his hands sinking into the cold mud, and whispered an apology to the creatures he couldn't save. The world he had built, ordered, precise, and peaceful, had been shattered in a single act of bureaucratic cruelty. Yet somewhere beneath the grief, another feeling began to stir, a slow, burning certainty that this wasn't over. They had drained his water, but they hadn't drained his resolve. And before this was finished, Jennifer Hope and her perfect little kingdom would learn what it meant to provoke the man who had spent his life mastering the balance of nature itself. 2 days passed before Daniel could bring himself to step outside again. The pond, once alive with rippling light and color, now resembled a crater of blackened mud and decay. The stench was unbearable, a mix of rotting algae and death that clung to the air even after rain fell overnight. He had spent those days making calls, filing complaints, and begging for someone, anyone, to take action. Every office he contacted passed the responsibility elsewhere. The county environmental department said it was a civil issue. The HOA's legal representative refused to discuss ongoing maintenance operations, and the local paper he had hoped would cover the story politely declined, saying they couldn't substantiate intent. It was as if a wall of polite indifference had been built around him, and every hand that could have helped had turned away. Only his lawyer, a young but sharp environmental attorney named Layla Wong, seemed to take him seriously. She listened in silence as Daniel described everything, then asked for photos, serial numbers, and any correspondence he had with the HOA. When she saw the maintenance authorization stamped with Jennifer Hope's signature, her expression darkened. "This wasn't a mistake," she said. "They knew exactly what they were doing. But if we're going to prove it, we'll need more than anger. We'll need proof of violation of property boundaries and abuse of municipal power." That night, Daniel returned to the pond to inspect the damage more carefully. The rain had softened the mud, exposing details he hadn't noticed before. A trail of footprints leading from the drainage cap toward the maintenance road, large enough to belong to work boots. He took photos of them, measuring the depth and angle, and followed the trail until he reached the corner where the HOA's retention basin began. There, hidden beneath the weeds, he found something metallic half buried in the soil, a piece of torn equipment tape with the same Hope Creek HOA Maintenance Division, marking as the new valve. He pocketed it, then noticed something even more telling. The edges of the drainage pipe bore fresh welding marks, as if the fitting had been replaced recently. When he brushed away the dirt, the weld seams still smelled faintly of burnt metal. Someone had been here within the last 48 hours. The next morning, he contacted Layla again, and they decided to file a preservation notice, requesting that the HOA produce all maintenance records from the past month. Hours later, he received an email from Jennifer's office, curt and defensive, claiming that no unauthorized actions were taken and that Mr. Murakami's unregulated pond created potential hazards to shared infrastructure. Attached was a photograph of his property taken from across the fence line, a low-resolution image showing the pond before it was drained, with a caption suggesting excess water overflow into community drainage. Daniel's blood boiled. They had not only invaded his land, they were documenting it as if he were the intruder. He drove straight to the HOA office that afternoon, a sterile building decorated with framed photos of smiling families and banners about community harmony. The receptionist, startled by his sudden entrance, tried to stop him, but he ignored her and pushed open the door to Jennifer's office. She was sitting behind her desk, calm as ever, a cup of tea steaming beside her keyboard. "Mr. Murakami," she said with that infuriatingly even tone, "I wasn't expecting you." He placed the printed photo on her desk. "Did you send your people onto my property without a warrant? Did you order them to tamper with my drainage system?" Jennifer looked down at the image, then back up at him, her face composed. "You're misunderstanding the situation. Our maintenance team had to ensure that no environmental risk was present. As far as I'm aware, they followed procedure." Daniel's voice rose. "Procedure doesn't include killing living creatures and destroying private property." Her expression hardened just slightly, a crack in her professional mask. "You've made your point, Mr. Murakami. But if you insist on taking a hostile stance, I'll have to refer this to our legal counsel. You may not like what that entails." He leaned forward, his voice low. "You drained my pond, and you think you can bury it under paperwork? I'll bury you in court." She smiled then, faintly but with unmistakable satisfaction. "Then I suppose we'll both be busy in the coming months." Her tone was so calm it made him want to shout, but he turned and left before he gave her the satisfaction. Outside, he stood by his car, breathing hard, his hands shaking. He knew now this wasn't about the pond. It was about power, about control. Jennifer Hope couldn't stand the fact that someone in her meticulously ordered neighborhood lived beyond her reach, and when she couldn't regulate him, she destroyed what she couldn't control. That evening, Daniel's security camera sent him an alert. He opened the feed to see two men in maintenance vests walking along the fence line, pointing flashlights toward the drained pond. One of them crouched, appearing to take pictures. He recorded the footage, backed it up on a hard drive, and sent a copy to Layla immediately. "They're still watching me," he wrote in his message. "They're not even hiding it." She responded within minutes. "That's good for us. It's intimidation. Keep documenting. The more evidence we collect, the stronger our case." But Daniel wasn't just angry anymore. He was unsettled. The next morning, when he left for work, he noticed something strange near his mailbox. A small, laminated note taped to the post, written in neat, almost cheerful handwriting. "Please remove hazardous structures and standing water to maintain property compliance. HOA inspection pending." There was no signature, but he knew who it came from. The message wasn't just a notice. It was a warning. Later that day, his neighbor, an older man named Peter, stopped him while walking his dog. "I heard about what happened," Peter said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was near. "Jennifer's been telling everyone it was your fault, that you ignored repeated requests to fix a leak. She's saying your pond was an accident waiting to happen." Daniel could barely respond. The lies were spreading faster than the truth, and the people who might have stood by him were already being turned against him. That night, Daniel sat by the empty pond with a lantern, listening to the insects and the faint hum of distant traffic. The mud had hardened into a cracked pattern that looked almost like broken glass. He stared at it for a long time, imagining the lives that had once moved gracefully beneath that surface. The silence felt heavier than before, pressing against his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt powerless. Yet, beneath that weight, another current began to move, a focused, methodical determination. He began listing every detail he remembered, every face, every time Jennifer's name appeared in correspondence, every odd remark in their meetings. If they wanted to bury him in bureaucracy, he would build his own wall of evidence brick by brick. He didn't care how long it took. The HOA had declared war on him, and though they didn't yet realize it, he wasn't a man who lost quietly. By the time he finally went back inside, the lantern's light was nearly gone, but Daniel felt something rekindled within him, a small, fierce flame that no amount of mud or malice could extinguish. Weeks turned into months, and the wounds that the drained pond had left behind never seemed to heal. Even after Daniel cleared the debris, repaired the piping, and installed security cameras around the perimeter, the air carried a faint odor of decay that clung to everything, like a reminder of what had been taken. The neighborhood had grown quieter toward him. Too quiet. Conversations stopped when he appeared, and cars slowed when they passed his property. Jennifer Hope's narrative had taken hold, that he was a defiant homeowner who endangered the community with an unregulated water hazard. Rumors spread faster than he could contain them, that he'd built the pond illegally, that chemicals from his filtration system had poisoned the soil, even that he'd threatened workers who came to help. Every story chipped away at his credibility until he could feel the isolation settle in like fog. The HOA had not only drained his pond, they were draining his reputation. But Layla refused to let him sink. "They want you to lose your composure," she told him one afternoon in her downtown office, papers scattered across the table between them. "They expect you to yell, to break, to become the angry neighbor everyone fears. That's their strategy. But if we play this right, we'll turn their arrogance into evidence." Together, they filed a motion demanding access to all HOA internal communications related to the drainage operation. For weeks, the association delayed, ignored, and deflected, until finally a judge granted them discovery rights. When the files arrived, delivered in a thick envelope marked "confidential," Daniel and Layla sat side by side and read in silence. The emails were damning. In one message chain, dated a week before the pond was drained, Jennifer had written to the board, "Murakami continues to ignore directives regarding his water feature. If he refuses voluntary compliance, we may need to initiate maintenance under Section 14B, citing flood prevention." Another reply came from a man Daniel recognized as the HOA's contracted engineer. "His system isn't connected to the HOA drainage grid. Any action there would technically fall outside jurisdiction." Jennifer's response was simple, almost casual. "Then we'll make sure it isn't outside jurisdiction anymore." Layla leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "That's your smoking gun," she said. They knew they had no right. They changed their story afterward to justify what they'd already planned. Daniel felt something break loose in his chest. Not relief, not quite triumph, but a heavy breath of vindication. For months he had doubted himself, questioned whether he had imagined their intent, and now he saw it spelled out in black and white. They hadn't made a mistake. They'd made an example out of him. They decided to build the case meticulously, gathering expert testimony from environmental consultants who confirmed that the HOA's actions had violated both state water management laws and federal wildlife protection statutes. Daniel's koi, several of which had been rare imports, were classified as protected species under certain conditions. When the news reached Jennifer's attorney, he tried to negotiate quietly, offering a settlement that would cover partial damages if Daniel agreed to withdraw his complaints. Daniel refused without hesitation. He wanted more than reimbursement. He wanted accountability. Soon after, Layla obtained a copy of an HOA board meeting recording, the one where Jennifer and her counsel had discussed the preventive drainage. The audio was grainy but clear enough to identify voices. Jennifer could be heard saying, "He's been told repeatedly, if he won't comply, we'll drain it under emergency measures. He'll learn that the rules apply to everyone." The others murmured in agreement, one of them even laughing. Then a man's voice, deep, uncertain, asked, "But what about the fish?" Jennifer's reply was crisp and chilling. "They're not our concern." When Daniel first heard the recording, he couldn't speak. The sound of her voice, so calm, so unfeeling, stripped away the last remnants of doubt. He replayed it again and again, hearing in those words not just malice but the quiet confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. He imagined her sitting in that meeting surrounded by people too cowardly to question her, signing off on the destruction of something sacred to him. The anger that had once burned like wildfire now settled into something colder, sharper, a sense of purpose honed to a point. Layla cautioned him that even with the evidence, the road ahead would be brutal. "Jennifer Hope is connected," she said. "She's got influence in the city council, donors in the development sector. This case might expose more than just her HOA. It could drag in the companies that profit from these enforcement loopholes. That means they'll fight dirty." Daniel nodded. "Then we fight dirtier, but cleanly. We'll do it by the book." A week later, a new setback arrived. One night, Daniel came home to find his storage shed broken into. The locks had been cut, and several hard drives containing footage from his security cameras were gone. Nothing else was taken. He stood there in the dim beam of his flashlight, realizing exactly what it meant. They knew what evidence he had and what it could cost them. He called the police, but the responding officer, the same one from before, shrugged helplessly. "No sign of forced entry on the fence," he said. "Could have been kids." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Kids with bolt cutters and legal knowledge of property lines?" The officer said nothing, just wrote his report and left. Layla advised him to stay cautious, suggesting he move his remaining evidence off-site. They stored the digital backups in a cloud server and printed physical copies of the most critical documents, which Daniel hid inside a waterproof case beneath a loose panel under his kitchen floorboards. Every night afterward, he found himself checking the locks twice, scanning the yard for movement, his once peaceful home now a fortress. Sometimes he thought he saw figures standing at the edge of his property, the faint glow of a cigarette in the dark, but when he stepped outside, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the grass. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered to the edge of the pond. The reconstruction had begun. He had hired a local contractor to reseal the lining and install reinforced gates over the drainage system, but the surface still reflected only emptiness. He crouched at the edge, touching the cool dirt where water used to shimmer, and whispered to the memory of the koi he'd lost. He thought about his father, who had once said that koi endure because they swim against the current, never yielding to the flow that seeks to carry them away. The phrase came back to him now, resonating differently. Maybe endurance wasn't about quiet resistance, but about surviving the storm and coming out harder than before. The next day, Layla called with unexpected news. "We've been granted a preliminary hearing," she said. "They tried to delay again, but the judge isn't buying it. It's happening next month." Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled. For the first time since that terrible morning, the horizon seemed to shift. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA would drag its feet, smear his name further, maybe even fabricate new accusations, but there was no turning back now. The evidence was undeniable, the timeline irrefutable, and the truth too loud to stay buried. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Daniel stood by the pond again, the first hints of its restoration visible. Clear water filling the basin, the faint hum of the rebuilt pump, the soft glint of a new filtration light beneath the surface. It wasn't yet alive, but it was no longer dead. He watched the ripples move outward, slow and deliberate, and realized that this was more than recovery. It was preparation. The HOA had taken his peace, his reputation, and nearly his sanity. but they had given him something in return, a purpose rooted in justice. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, not as a victim, but as a man reclaiming what was stolen. And though Jennifer Hope still smiled in her photos and walked her perfect streets like a queen among subjects, Daniel knew the illusion of her control was beginning to crack. Beneath the surface, the current had changed direction, and it was only a matter of time before the tide turned against her. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of tension and exhaustion. Daniel found himself living in a rhythm of preparation and paranoia, alternating between hours spent reviewing documents with Layla and sleepless nights staring through his window, convinced that every flicker of light outside marked another intrusion. The HOA's campaign against him only intensified. He began receiving anonymous letters in his mailbox, copies of fabricated community complaints claiming that runoff from his illegal pond reconstruction had caused erosion on adjacent properties. One included a printed photograph of his backyard, taken from an angle only accessible from inside his fence. Another bore a single sentence written in tidy block letters. "Stop before you lose more than fish." He brought the letters to the police, but they dismissed them as neighbor disputes, advising him to avoid escalation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The escalation was all theirs. Meanwhile, Jennifer Hope continued her public performance of civility. She appeared at HOA meetings and community events, addressing residents in measured tones about the importance of collective safety and compliance. Layla had advised Daniel not to confront her in public, but he could feel her shadow everywhere, the subtle shifts in his neighbor's expressions, the way conversations faltered when he passed. Once, a mother who used to wave from across the street pulled her child closer when he walked by, whispering something about toxins in the water. It was a slow, deliberate isolation, and it was working. But what Jennifer didn't realize was that the pressure she applied was forging Daniel into something harder, something dangerous. When the court subpoena forced the HOA to produce maintenance records, a new layer of corruption surfaced. Layla's paralegal discovered inconsistencies between the official reports and the timestamps on the drainage permits. Several entries had been altered retroactively, suggesting that the HOA had falsified documentation to justify their actions after the fact. Even worse, the engineering firm contracted to inspect the site turned out to be owned by a company that had previously done landscaping projects for Jennifer's husband's real estate developments. The conflict of interest was undeniable, and Layla immediately moved to include it in their case file. Then, one night, Daniel was woken by the blaring of his security alarm. He rushed outside barefoot, the cold grass slick beneath his feet, and saw the reflection of headlights vanishing down the road. Near the pond, the fence was cut open, and two of the newly installed pumps lay destroyed, their metal casings smashed and wires torn out. A faint chemical smell hung in the air, bleach or chlorine, and the surface of the water shimmered faintly under the moonlight, a pale film spreading across it like oil. Panic clawed at him as he realized what had been done. Someone had dumped chemicals into the water, maybe to kill the new koi he had just begun reintroducing. He ran to the hose, trying to flush the system, coughing from the fumes. By morning, 5 of the young fish were dead. Layla's jaw tightened when she saw the photos. "This isn't vandalism anymore," she said. "This is targeted sabotage. We'll file for an injunction." But Daniel already knew who was behind it. He could almost see Jennifer's cold satisfaction, the way she would later feign surprise at the incident, call it regrettable, while denying involvement. He imagined her sipping her morning coffee, reading the report, and smiling. That image fueled him. When the hearing finally arrived, the courtroom felt heavy with tension. Jennifer sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 attorneys and a stack of organized binders. She wore white, immaculate, and poised, the picture of composure. Daniel sat beside Layla, his hands clasped, his jaw tight. The HOA's lawyer began with an opening statement that painted Daniel as a combative homeowner who refused cooperation with reasonable safety inspections. Their words were practiced, polished, and drenched in artificial concern. When Layla stood, her tone was different, measured but piercing. She began by playing the audio from the HOA meeting, Jennifer's voice filling the room with its cool, bureaucratic cruelty. "If he won't comply, we'll drain it under emergency measures." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jennifer's attorneys tried to object, claiming the tape was taken out of context, but the damage was already done. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Layla then presented the emails, the altered records, and the photos of the welded drainage pipe bearing the HOA's markings. She explained how the association had exploited vague language in their bylaws to extend jurisdiction unlawfully over private property. When she spoke about the koi, about their value, their rarity, their symbolic significance, her voice softened just enough to remind everyone that this wasn't about money. It was about loss. About arrogance disguised as governance. Jennifer maintained her composure until Layla presented one final piece of evidence, a report from the State Environmental Agency showing traces of industrial disinfectant in the water, matching the chemical compound used by the HOA's contracted cleaning crews. The room seemed to tilt then, all eyes turning to Jennifer. For the first time, her polished mask cracked. "That's absurd," she snapped, her voice rising. "We never approved chemical use near that property. Someone must have tampered with—" But Layla cut her off gently. "You mean the way someone tampered with his drainage system?" The judge intervened, requesting silence. His ruling wouldn't come until the final hearing, but the tide was shifting visibly. The HOA's attorneys looked rattled, whispering among themselves. As the session ended, Jennifer brushed past Daniel in the hallway, her perfume sharp and cold. "You think this is over?" she murmured without looking at him. "You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with." Daniel met her gaze and said quietly, "No, Jennifer. I understand perfectly. You're the kind of people who mistake power for law, and that's about to change." That night, Daniel returned home to find his porch light shattered and his mailbox hanging open, a single dead koi placed inside. It was small, no bigger than his palm, one of the fish that had survived the chemical attack. He stared at it for a long time, the grotesque symbolism making his stomach turn. Whoever had done this wanted him to know that the war wasn't just about property anymore. It was personal. He buried the fish beside the pond under the light of a single lantern, his face expressionless. There was no fear left in him, only focus. The HOA had turned his life into a battlefield, and now there would be no truce. He knew the coming weeks would bring retaliation, but he no longer cared. For 20 years, he had devoted himself to nurturing life in still water. Now he would channel that same precision, that same patience, into dismantling the corrupt machine that had tried to destroy him. The tide had risen again, and this time, he was the storm. The final hearing began under a heavy gray sky that seemed to press against the courthouse windows, the air inside thick with a sense of reckoning. Daniel sat in silence beside Layla, his hands folded, his expression calm but unreadable. Months of exhaustion had settled into him, yet beneath that fatigue burned a steady resolve that nothing could shake. Across the room, Jennifer Hope sat surrounded by her legal team, her pristine white suit replaced by a muted gray one, as though she knew the color of the day demanded something less triumphant. Her face was still, almost frozen, but her eyes betrayed the faint flicker of unease that no amount of discipline could hide. The judge entered, and the murmur of voices died instantly. What had begun as a neighborhood dispute had evolved into something far larger, a confrontation between personal integrity and institutional arrogance. Layla began the closing argument with the quiet precision of a scalpel. She spoke not with outrage but with clarity, detailing every deliberate step that led to the destruction of Daniel's pond, the unauthorized drainage order, the falsified maintenance records, the intimidation tactics, and finally the environmental contamination that followed. Each piece of evidence was a strike in a slow, deliberate dismantling of the facade Jennifer had built around herself. "This case is not about aesthetics or compliance," Layla said, her voice steady. "It is about the abuse of power under the guise of governance. It is about an organization that forgot its duty to protect and instead chose to punish." Mr. Murakami's pond was not merely a structure. It was a living ecosystem, a cultural inheritance and a work of devotion 20 years in the making. The defendants did not act out of concern for safety. They acted out of spite because control had been denied to them. The courtroom remained still as she finished, her final words echoing in the air. The HOA's lead attorney rose to counter, his tone defensive and theatrical, insisting that the board had acted in good faith and that any damage was an unfortunate result of miscommunication. But when the judge questioned the legality of the drainage action, the attorney faltered. "There appears," the judge said slowly, flipping through the pages of the bylaws, "to be no clause granting the HOA authority to modify or interfere with systems located entirely on private, non-communal property. And yet, Miss Hope's correspondence clearly indicates prior intent to do exactly that." He paused, looking over his glasses toward Jennifer. "Would you care to explain?" Jennifer stood, smoothing the front of her jacket, her composure cracking only slightly. "Your Honor, we were acting on multiple complaints from residents regarding potential overflow risks. The decision was made to prevent greater harm." Her voice was firm but edged with strain. The judge nodded once. "And did you confirm those complaints with a certified inspection?" Jennifer hesitated, glancing at her lawyer. "We relied on internal reports." The pause that followed was fatal. Layla rose, holding up a printed document, the same email where Jennifer had written, "Then we'll make sure it isn't outside jurisdiction anymore." The judge took it, read in silence, then set it down carefully. When he spoke, his tone had changed, heavy with measured disapproval. This was not an act of prevention. It was an act of retribution. The HOA's authority, while broad, is not absolute, and it certainly does not extend to destruction of personal property under false pretenses. I find sufficient evidence to support the plaintiff's claim of willful damage and abuse of power. Jennifer's attorney tried to object, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "The court orders the HOA to compensate Mr. Murakami for the full appraised value of the destroyed property, $200,000, plus legal costs and damages for emotional distress. Furthermore, this case will be referred to the district prosecutor for review under environmental violation statutes." For a moment, there was only the sound of papers rustling. Jennifer sat back down slowly, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The victory didn't come with applause, only silence, the kind of silence that follows the fall of something once thought untouchable. Daniel exhaled, not in triumph but in relief so profound it left him dizzy. Layla turned to him, a faint smile breaking through her professional composure. "It's over," she whispered. But Daniel knew it wasn't really over. Justice had been served in law, but what had been taken could never truly be restored. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft at first and then heavier, washing the courthouse steps in silver streaks. Jennifer emerged behind him, shielded by an umbrella held by one of her lawyers. As she passed, she looked at him, not with hatred but with something closer to disbelief, as if she still couldn't understand how she had lost to someone she had once dismissed as insignificant. Daniel met her gaze for only a moment before turning away. He didn't need to say anything. The outcome spoke for itself. When he returned home that evening, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle that blurred the reflection of the security lights on the pond's surface. The restoration was nearly complete now. The new filtration system hummed softly, the gates were sealed, and the water glimmered with renewed life. A few of the surviving koi swam cautiously in the shallows, their movements graceful and unhurried, as though testing whether the world was safe again. Daniel stood beneath his umbrella, watching them until the rain soaked through his shoes. For the first time in months, the silence of his property no longer felt oppressive. It was peaceful again, the way it used to be, but now layered with the knowledge of what it had cost to reclaim it. He thought about the courtroom, about Jennifer's final expression, and about the fragile balance that had been restored not by forgiveness but by consequence. The HOA had tried to strip him of control, of dignity, of peace, but in the end it was their own system of rules and laws that had undone them. The irony was almost poetic. As lightning flickered faintly on the horizon, Daniel knelt by the pond, letting the rain run down his face, and whispered, not to the court or the HOA or even to Jennifer Hope, but to the water itself. "You're safe now." Then he stood, straightened, his back, and walked toward the house, leaving behind the rippling surface that once again reflected the quiet persistence of a man who refused to be drained dry. The weeks after the verdict passed like the long exhale after a storm. The neighborhood that had once treated Daniel like a pariah now watched him in cautious silence, some out of guilt, others out of uneasy respect. The HOA's power fractured almost overnight. Jennifer Hope resigned before the prosecutor's investigation even began, her polished reputation dissolving in a flood of leaked emails and quiet testimonies from former board members who had grown tired of covering her excesses. The association replaced her with a new interim president, a mild-mannered retiree who spoke about rebuilding trust and transparency, words that floated gently but without conviction. The glossy newsletters stopped arriving, the constant patrols of rule enforcers disappeared, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood seemed to breathe. Daniel didn't attend the first community meeting after the verdict, though he received a formal apology letter signed by every remaining member of the board. He left it unopened on the kitchen counter, its envelope slowly curling in the humidity. He didn't need their words, not anymore. Justice, imperfect as it was, had been rendered, and the rest belonged to memory. His focus was on the pond, now fully restored, its surface alive again with the shimmering movement of new koi he had carefully selected, descendants of the same bloodlines he and his father had once raised. The first morning he released them, he stood barefoot at the edge, the water cold around his ankles, the fish darting from his hands in flashes of white, gold, and crimson. He watched them disappear into the depths, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been locked there for months. Neighbors began stopping by again, tentatively at first. Some brought flowers, others offered quiet words of apology or gratitude for standing up to them. A few younger residents helped him plant reeds and lilies around the pond's edge, their laughter carrying across the water like echoes from a gentler time. The community, fractured and bruised, was beginning to understand that fear of authority had kept them complicit for too long. Change didn't come from rebellion alone, Daniel realized. It came from endurance, from the refusal to yield even when the world pressed down with its full weight. One evening, as the sun slipped low behind the trees, he noticed one koi swimming apart from the rest, a pure white fish with a faint orange mark near its head, almost shaped like a crescent flame. Sue, he named it Hope, not as a tribute to the woman who had tried to destroy him, but as a reclamation of the word itself, something cleansed of its former cruelty. The reflection of the fish glimmered beside his own, and for a moment he saw in that mirrored surface both the past and what he had rebuilt from it. The pain had not vanished, but it had transformed, like water moving through stone, shaping without surrender. That night, he sat on the porch with the soft hum of the pumps behind him and the sound of rain beginning to fall again, light and rhythmic. The pond glowed faintly under the garden lamps, alive, self-contained, resilient. For 20 years it had been his sanctuary. Now it was his testament. He understood finally that peace was not the absence of conflict but the calm that follows when one has faced it fully and refused to bend. The HOA had drained his pond, but in doing so they had exposed something deeper, his capacity to fight, to rebuild, and to forgive only on his own terms. As thunder rolled far away and the rain deepened, Daniel closed his eyes and listened to the steady pulse of the water returning to life.